Good evening and welcome once again to a much anticipated, lengthy, delayed Commander's Gridiron. I'm your host, Steve Lockman. Thanks for tuning in tonight, where we talk all things Washington Commanders football on and off the field. So as you may have noticed, we're starting a little late tonight. And it's not actually by accident. It's actually going to be by design. Starting from here on forward, we're going to be shifting our show a little bit later in the evening. So you can mark your calendars. It's still going to be on Tuesday night. It's just going to be a little later to help facilitate the sleeping schedule of my lovely 7.5-month-old daughter. We've been trying to get her down for a routine sleep night, which basically starts right around the time that we were doing our original podcast show, around 6:30. So it just kind of works out better if we can start a little bit later. So we're going to be bringing you the same great content, same great show every Tuesday, moving forward, just at a later time, starting about 8:30 p.m. on Tuesdays. Now, as we move into the off season, we're not going to be doing every Tuesday. We're probably going to be doing about every other, maybe on a bi-weekly basis, maybe every third, to help coincide with my work schedule at the firehouse. So that'll kind of remain to be seen. But, keep your eyes up on social media, on the Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch, and Out of the Box Sports Network to get your notifications about the show and when it's going to be. But it will be on Tuesdays. It's just a matter of what day it's going to be to give us stuff to talk about. And as you know, there's never a shortage of stuff to talk about with our team. So, hey, look, as Paul says, hey, wait a minute, Commanders in prime time, 8:30. That makes no sense, right? I'll tell you this, like I said it, in the regular season, we are not very good at prime time as a team. But as this show going into prime time, hey, maybe we're finally moving up to the big boys, with Dave and Paul, them 215 boys, that they do their shows on Wednesday nights from prime time. So maybe we're finally just slightly inching up to their caliber, but we'll see. So as you know, even though our season got cut short, we didn't make the playoffs. There's no postseason berth. There's no future football for us here going into the postseason. There's still just as much news and discussion and talk with the Washington Commanders going around league circles. And what better way to start that than, look, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago that come Black Monday on January 8th, we knew Ron Rivera and company were going to be canned, and Josh Harris and company didn't wait. They at least had the decency to wait until Black Monday to do it, because Sunday of week 18 was actually Coach Rivera's birthday. So, come Monday morning, they had the exit interview with Rivera. Harris cans him. Cans basically the entire staff. There's still a bunch of, whether officially all those guys have been canned or not. Let's be honest, they have. They just might not have been, given their official papers as of, 2 weeks ago or a week ago, whatever, even yesterday. But everybody pretty much knows, hey, look, they're cleaning house. Whole new regime coming in. So Josh Harris says, hey, look, here's what I'm going to do. It's going to be a thorough, going to be a swift, going to be a very in-depth investigative process to land two people. One's going to be a head of football operations, basically a GM on the football side of things, and then a new head coach as well. And according to Josh Harris, it was going to be him, Magic Johnson, Mitchell Rales, Mark Ein, Bob Myers, and Rick Spielman. The latter two are former executives of professional sports teams, championship caliber sports teams. So, look, they wasted no time in getting to where they needed to go. And, they started that coach search and candidate list for GM as well. And Mixed in a lot of that was talk of where Rivera was going to go and what Rivera was going to do. There's a lot of speculation that, hey, look, was Rivera going to be hung around as a consultant, kind of like Pete Carroll did in Seattle? Would Rivera stick around and take a DC opportunity here in DC, right, as a defensive coordinator? What were his plans going to be? Is he just going to take a year off, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's super interesting that, he gets canned on January 8th. Not really a whole lot of talk about what he wants to do. A week goes by, and you kind of think that, hey, look, he's going to ride off into the sunset, maybe take a year off, then maybe go explore some coaching opportunities, TV, consulting, whatever. And then lo and behold, pops out in the media a couple days ago that Ron Rivera has in fact interviewed with our divisional rival, the Philadelphia Eagles, for their defensive coordinator vacancy. That Desai vacated, I guess, basically got fired by Nick Sirianni in Philadelphia a little over a week ago. And it was kind of interesting. So that, hey, look, so here's the first thing. First off, the turmoil in Philadelphia results in basically, first-year coordinators being replaced already. Now, is that a result because of their late season collapse? Is that because of personnel issues? Is it because of coaching, issues? Whatever, it'll remain to be seen what comes out of all that, But late in the season, they actually brought in Matt Patricia to try and do some play calling, defensive scheming type deal, but didn't really take Desai's title away, blah, 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 blah. Lo and behold, end of the season, they get rid of him. Now they got a defensive coordinator vacancy. Ron Rivera has now basically interviewed for that position, keyed to be one of the front runners for it. So, it'll be interesting to see if in fact he gets that, and B, if he does, what kind of dynamic that's going to bring between Commanders Eagles games, of which, we always play our divisional games twice a year for the 2024 campaign. So just something to keep your eye on. Definitely something to see. I don't think he's going to go anywhere for a head coaching vacancy next year. Doesn't have that caliber, but I could definitely see him resorting back to a defensive coordinator position. Now, whether or not he does, defensive coordinator for the Eagles or any other vast number of coaching vacancies in the NFL remains to be seen. But I think he's going to land somewhere, right? And as Paul says, hey, look, Eagles back-to-back seasons, they have offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator changes. Absolutely. Now, the bad news about that is, when you're good, your coordinators leave for good reasons. When you're bad, coordinators leave for bad reasons, right? So it'll definitely remain to be seen what kind of happens there in Philadelphia, where he might go. One thing to keep in mind, look, it was 13 years ago, but the last time Rivera was actually a defensive coordinator, he actually had one of the top three defenses in the NFL when he was a defensive coordinator for the Chargers back in the day before his head coaching stint in Carolina, which actually resulted in him in being the head coach of the Carolina Panthers for a while. So, he does have the pedigree, so to speak, to be the defensive coordinator. Now, is he too outdated, too old guard to be a defensive coordinator in the league? That remains to be seen. But, we wish him the best of luck. He did amazing things here in DC, even though we didn't get to the playoffs, didn't become an annual, playoff contending team. He was the right guy for the time to take our team through what it basically was going through with the shittiest owner in the NFL for 4 years, and did a tremendous job, in my opinion. And I wish him nothing but the best. So, with that being said, then it kind of kicks forward to, look, now we have the true vacancies across the board on the X's and O's side of things, and where do we go? So before we get into the search of, who we interviewed, the process that it took, and, ended up basically who ended up having that position, that we're going to talk about who he is and where he came from and why he got the job. One of the things that, for those of you that are football fans, you'll know this. And for those of you that aren't diehard football fans, we're going to kind of fill you in a little bit on why they do what they do. But, there's a long list of candidates that the Commanders entourage and, along with Bob Myers and Rick Spielman interviewed, they were looking for, I think it was 6 to 7 candidates for the GM position. The head of football operations, as Josh Harris coined it so many times in his press conferences. But there's individuals that they ended up interviewing for that position included Browns assistant GM Glenn Cook, Eagles assistant GM Alec Hallaby, the Chiefs assistant GM Mike Borgonzi, the Ravens head of scouting Joe Horitz, actually the Cowboys vice president player of personnel Will McClay, the Bears assistant GM Ian Cunningham, which kind of brings up our next point, and the 49ers assistant GM Adam Peters. Hey, Eileen, thanks for checking in tonight. Glad to have you on. Thanks for listening. As we always are appreciative of everybody that tunes in every week to hear Commanders Gridiron as we talk all things Commanders. So one of the things that was interesting about that process is the Rooney Rule, right? And back in, actually, it's in its 21st year. So in 2002, I guess it was, named for the late president, or I guess chairman of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Dan Rooney. It was actually a mandate for a rule in the NFL that all teams must interview at least one minority candidate for all head coaching positions. Now, it started out as just a head coaching position requirement, but then it has subsequently, over the last decade, kind of evolved to basically help diversify the coaching and management ranks within the NFL, so that the Rooney Rule now applies to all managerial positions as well as coaching and coordinator vacancies. So what exactly does that mean? Basically, that means that every team, whether you have an offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, head coach, GM, assistant GM, whatever, basically the hierarchy of your team, as you go through the interview process, you must interview at least one minority candidate for each of those position openings to satisfy the Rooney Rule. Now, there is no regulation or requirement that you must hire a minority to fill those positions. However, it's just basically saying that you're giving the minorities a shot at those positions by interviewing them. Now, in some cases, a lot of teams will interview minorities just to satisfy the Rooney Rule, which we all know happens in some circumstances. But, as in a lot of more recent times across the NFL, whether it's head coaches, whether it's GMs, whether it's assistant GMs, presidents, whatever the titles may be, you are seeing more minorities stepping up into those positions of power in that hierarchy of the NFL coaching and management structures. So it kind of is working to some degree, but it kind of puts us where we are in the list of the candidates that I just read off, right? And basically after the first round interviews that the Commanders did, it basically came down to Ian Cunningham, who's the assistant GM of the Chicago Bears, and Adam Peters, who was the assistant GM of the San Francisco 49ers. And basically, the good news for Commanders fans was that both Cunningham and Peters have told other teams no, especially while they're going through the process for the Washington Commanders GM spot, so that they weren't interested. So it basically showed, excuse me, it'll show, the fans and the media and other team circles that, look, they're both in the running for the Washington job. It basically shows that the Washington job is a job that's desired, whether it's the draft capital, whether it's the cap space and monetary value, whether it's, new, viable, aggressive ownership, whether it's good roster, with some building blocks, et cetera, that, this is somewhere that they wanted to be. So, as luck would have it, they ended up coming out after the first two rounds. Those two guys were the finalists to run the football operations of the Washington Commanders. The sense around the league and the DC circles was that Adam Peters was going to be the favorite. And, look, they ended up doing second round interviews. They ended up flying a contingent down to Florida, to Josh Harris's house down in Florida, to do a final round interview. And as we know, the new GM of the Washington Commanders was selected, and it is Adam Peters, who was the assistant GM of the San Francisco 49ers. And as Paul says, Peters' track record is great. 6 conference championships, 3 Super Bowls, great insight hire. And, I couldn't agree more, right? So, he had his introductory press conference, and then the question becomes, to people who aren't necessarily in the inner circles of other teams or their management, circle, hierarchy, pyramid, let's be honest. Most fans will know who every head coach is of every NFL team. Some fans, or even majority of fans, will know GMs or especially owners of other teams, right? But then once you kind of get into the even GMs of other teams, most fans are kind of like who, what, especially when you get into the assistants, right? So even though Adam Peters has been around a while, a lot of times people are like, well, who is Adam Peters? So, look, one of the things that, let's kind of backtrack and figure out, well, who is Adam Peters, right? Adam Peters has done 3 different stints with professional football teams in his front office career. He spent 21 seasons in the NFL in front offices. As Paul alluded to a couple minutes ago, he is a member of 3 Super Bowl winning teams, 2 with New England, 1 with Denver. And, look, as we kind of started at the very beginning, he started with the New England Patriots as a scout for 2003 to 2008. So he basically was around the New England Patriots in that whole Tom Brady era, when that got ushered in, and they kind of went through the beginning-ish, kind of he kind of left at the very beginning of their dynasty run or their assimilation together, right? But, he did win 2 Super Bowls as part of that organization there in New England. Then he went to the Denver Broncos in 2009 to 2016, where he was the director of college scouting, the assistant director of college scouting, and then obviously, a national and regional scout for them as well. So he did a lot of talent evaluation, did a lot of scouting, did a lot of, draft prep, helped those teams there, assemble the rosters that they ended up putting together. And, lo and behold, he won a Super Bowl with Denver as well. So, then basically when John Lynch takes over as GM of the San Francisco 49ers in 2017, he selects Adam Peters from the Denver Broncos to come over and be the vice president of player personnel. And then basically, promotes him to become the assistant general manager with him as they run the San Francisco 49ers. Hey, Ken, thanks for checking in tonight, buddy. I see that you, as a fan of the Raiders, got a lot to talk about on the management side of things, like I do as well. So it'll be interesting to see what you have coming up on your show, as Ken talks all things about the Las Vegas Raiders. And as we keep continuing talking about Adam Peters, it's interesting that okay, so it's a guy that kind of shows that he truly worked his way up in the NFL system, NFL circles, so to speak. Started from the ground up, but basically he went from football player to executive. So basically he was a JUCO tight end. He's a walk-on defensive end at UCLA. It's basically where he played his college ball at. He was a graduate assistant in football ops at UCLA once he graduated from there. Then he basically became the scouting assistant, as I just mentioned, in New England. Then became the pro scout and basically area scout for the Patriots and help assemble all those teams, right? And, basically, as we alluded to, then he moved on to basically take those scouting skills and knowledge with him over to Denver after he won some Super Bowls in New England, to become the regional and national scouts in Denver. Then he becomes the assistant director of college scouting in Denver, and as well as the director of college scouting in Denver. So, he has definitely this fine eye for evaluating talent, which is so desperately needed for our team here in DC. As Paul says, hey, man, geez, wish I could have a new coach and a GM, right? Ooh, man, I'll tell you what. It's interesting because, Jerry Jones comes out and says, hey, I'm not firing Mike McCarthy, but we're not going to extend his contract. So he's basically coaching as a lame duck, right? And as a fan, I would rather be in my situation here in DC, where we're getting all new revamped coaching staff and management staff, compared to, kind of, hey, the reboot, the rebrand for you guys down there in Dallas, where you're going to try and roll it back another year, get your guys healthy again, and see what you can do with the draft and free agency, kind of going through, right? And I couldn't agree with you more that the Cowboys coaches are Jerry's puppets, and it's interesting because you always see guys that Jerry brings in that are basically just an extension of Jerry, right? Which kind of begs, to see who they're going to name as the head coach here in DC, because I see Harris being kind of like a laissez-faire type owner where he's only going to get involved where he needs to. And he's going to let, the people that he puts into those positions make those decisions. And it was great, you know, leadership on his part to select Adam Peters, because he knows that he's going to empower Peters to make the decisions that he does. Look, maybe all the final decisions do run through Harris just as a courtesy and everything else, but I see Harris being the one that says, hey, look, I hired you for a reason. Here's what you have to work with. Here's your limitations. Here's your restrictions. Go get me a winning team. And I can definitely see that happening with Harris. And, look, since joining the 49ers as vice president of player personnel in 2017 with John Lynch, and they added Kyle Shanahan as their coach out there in San Fran, Adam Peters has been on a staff where, between evaluating college talent and scouting and stuff like that with the NFL Combine, the NFL Draft, etc., he has drafted 5 first-team All-Pros. Let that sink in, right? So the last 2 All-Pros that Washington has had has been Brandon Scherf and Trent Williams in the last 10 years. So let that sink in. But, like I said, and since 2017, he has drafted 5 first-team All-Pros. Those players were Nick Bosa in the first round, Deebo Samuel in the second round. Nick Bosa first round, Deebo Samuel second, Fred Warner third, George Kittle fifth, and Hufanga in the fifth, right? So, and as I just alluded to, the last drafted All-Pro for Washington was Brandon Scherf in 2015. So we're going on almost 9 years since our last drafted All-Pro. And here, Adam Peters is knocking that out in San Francisco basically on an annual basis. So, that's been one of the biggest arguments against Rivera was, basically his eye to evaluate talent and whether or not he can do it. And, just his, I don't want to say eye for talent, but his evaluation of the players and the roster that he has. So he never wanted to make, the die hard nuts and bolts, pound the pavement decisions on roster changes, right? We know we needed a better offensive line, but he didn't want to go out and either sign them in free agency or draft. We always were drafting project pieces in drafts, whether it was this past draft, 2 drafts ago, 3 drafts ago. We did pick up some good guys in the drafts, but then the overwhelming majority of our drafts were, 50% to below 50% impact players that, will probably be good in like 2 to 3 years. But, you need those guys to be hitting, on all cylinders, on the ground running, going into August training camp. And, we're just not getting that here in DC over the last couple of seasons. So, it's even more crucial that, we get the draft right. And I feel that Adam Peters is going to do that. And, it's super interesting that, one of the, in the introductory press conference that Josh Harris had with Adam Peters and in naming him the new GM, look, Peters does, the big thing. He comes out and he says, how incredible grateful he is to Harris and the ownership group for giving him this opportunity. Thank the York family, John Lynch, Kyle Shanahan, the 49ers organization for, that experience and their tutelage and everything like that. And, throughout his NFL career, he learned that successful organizations begin with a strong ownership group, willing to commit the resources needed to foster a culture of winning. He believes that we have that here in Washington, and it's his responsibility and privilege to carry out that mission given to him by Josh Harris and company to deliver a team that will ultimately compete for Super Bowls. I know how much the Commanders mean to our fans, the owners, and the legends who paved the way for this franchise. So he definitely gets it, and he has the track record to kind of prove that he gets it, right? So then the question is, well, how's he going to do what he's going to do? So, in his Q&A with the media, Adam Peters goes on to say that, the Commanders roster has some cornerstone pieces, but there's a lot of work to do to get better. He says that him and the head coach will work in unison to get those objectives accomplished. This is where I'm supposed to be, the general manager of the Washington Commanders. I promise you I'll work tirelessly to build this franchise. This is one of the cornerstone franchises of the NFL. I couldn't be more thrilled to be here. Then the question was posed to him by JP Finley of 1067 The Fan here in DC that, look, what's your strategy on building the roster and kind of like how do you accomplish that, right? And he goes, ultimately, we're going to build the roster through the draft and supplement that through in free agency. And it's kind of interesting that he says that because, he's absolutely right. I love his approach. I love his vision to get that done. It just kind of sucks that is in reverse, right? Free agency comes first in the NFL in March. As we know, the new league year starts usually around March 13th, 15th, give or take a couple days, is when free agency starts. Then with the draft happening at the end of April, is when you kind of go in, spend all of your draft capital, and kind of go from there. Now, that's not to say that you can't add pieces from the time of free agency through the draft all the way up until training camp, which I know that they're probably going to do extensively here in DC. But, it's just something interesting that, it gives fans reasons to be excited and kind of have some optimism for the future. Look, we're probably not going to be a perennial powerhouse in 2024, 25 alone. It's probably going to be a 2 to 3 year, I don't want to say experiment, but journey. But it's not going to be a complete rebuild, right? We're not tearing this thing down completely. We're just going to try to add some pieces and kind of go from there. And, look, Adam Peters thought that, the Commanders GM was the best opportunity in his mind in the NFL, which is why he took the opportunity to come here from San Francisco to DC. As I just alluded to, Peters also noted in his press conference, this is not a total rebuild. This is a wonderful group of people that just needs leadership. That's what we're here to bring, and I can do that from my experience in San Francisco. So, I think that, look, we got all the pieces. I don't want to say we got all the pieces. We got so many holes on our team and our roster. It's not funny, but we have a good core group of building blocks that him and whoever becomes the head coach that we're going to talk about here in a couple of minutes can do to put a competitive roster on the field for 2024. Something I think that Ron Rivera took for granted, that he thought that, our roster was good enough when, anybody in the average casual fan could look at on paper and be like, we're not that good. So as Paul says, between Peters and Bob Myers could change the team in the right direction. And I think you're absolutely right that, between Myers, who's going to stay on as a consultant at least until through the draft, as well as, through the head coach selection process. Spielman, who's staying on as a consultant for Josh Harris as well, kind of in the same capacity. Just getting like minds of championship caliber franchises, no matter what sport, in the same room can never be a bad thing, right? It just can't. And, before we talk about the head coach searching update, we're going to talk about our sponsors here at Out of the Box Sports Network. Real quick, the first one up is going to be Monkey Cult Coffee. Our friends over there at Monkey Cult Coffee have the newest blend, which is an organic blend, Peru, La Florida. So jump on monkeycultcoffee.com and use promo code OOTB Sports for your 10% off. Remember, they have bourbon chocolate chip, toasted coconut rum, and a Sumatran blend to go along with their latest blend, that organic blend, Peru, La Florida. So use promo code OOTB Sports for your 10% off at Monkey Cult Coffee for all your coffee needs, whether it's coffee cups, coffee grinders, whatever you need. Hit them up at monkeycultcoffee.com. And lastly, our good buddy Jason Fine, attorney Big Al, at 1-800-HURT-123. Jason specializes in motor vehicle accidents, slip and falls, workman's comp, personal injury claims, has 3 convenient office locations throughout Pennsylvania and New Jersey, in Philadelphia, PA, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and Pittsburgh, PA. Tell him you saw us here or that you got mentioned at Out of the Box Sports Network. He will hook you up. Remember, no fee unless you win. And that's Jason Fine, attorney Big Al. Whether your team is like mine, losing on a weekly basis, or whether you get hurt legitimately out and about in today's society, give our buddy Jason Fine, attorney Big Al, a call at 1-800-HURT-123 and let him represent you for all of your legal needs. All right. As we jump back into the second half of tonight's show, we kind of already have talked about, hey, look, we got our GM and who we needed. We got the best candidate out there in Adam Peters. And, Myers is a definite genius. He built the Warriors through the draft. He got the dynasty with Steph Curry, Klay Thompson. Exactly, right? And I think that, when you bring all of those people together, and it doesn't have to necessarily, and this is where I kind of applaud Josh Harris, Magic Johnson, and those guys that, for thinking outside of the box. A lot of times people think, I need to bring football minds into the circle. I need to bring this. I need to bring that. But, you already have a championship pedigree mindset in Magic Johnson on your team. You already have successful business people in Mitchell Rales and Mark Ein and other limiting partners of, with Josh Harris and David Blitzer, who's also one of the other minority owners as well. And then when you bring in some outside championship caliber executives like Myers and Spielman, it only can't do any bad, right? So where do they focus now? That focus now turns to head coaching. And now that Peters is kind of in place, even while they were doing the search for Peters, they kind of started the initial Zoom get to know meet and greets with head coaching candidates, right? And that list was like 8 or 9 long. Let's run them down real quick. It was Lions defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn, Lions offensive coordinator Ben Johnson, Rams defensive coordinator Raheem Morris, Ravens assistant head coach D-line Anthony Weaver, Cowboys defensive coordinator Dan Quinn, Commanders offensive coordinator Eric Bieniemy, Texans offensive coordinator Bobby Slowick, Michigan coach Jim Harbaugh, and Ravens defensive coordinator Mike McDonald. Now, some of those guys are still coaching here as they make their playoff runs with their respective teams, which is probably about half that list. One name that came off the list fairly quickly, even though he had, the initial meet and greet, Zoom, whatever, get to know you, was Jim Harbaugh. I can honestly see Harbaugh probably landing with the Chargers, maybe somewhere else, but he's obviously not going to be, the coach here in DC, which I'm perfectly okay with. And as Paul says, hey, look, here's the long shot. Steve Wilkes, the D coach for the Niners, best person would be Ben Johnson, but the best cultural fit is Harbaugh. He builds culture, philosophy is team away, right? And he was super successful in his first stint as head coach of the San Francisco 49ers. So, where he had a Super Bowl appearance with them. But, as we look at that list, Lions defensive coordinator still coaching, Lions offensive coordinator still coaching. Mike McDonald, getting ready for the AFC Championship game against the Kansas City Chiefs. Detroit Lions getting ready for the NFC Championship game, respectively with them against the 49ers. So, excuse me. But it's interesting who's going where and kind of who's getting the second round of interviews, right? So as we know, Dan Quinn, defensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys, actually came in for a second in-person interview with the Washington Commanders. But, kind of as you keep track of the coaching carousel, Quinn's been busy. He also met with the Titans on Wednesday. He's going to be meeting with the Seahawks on Thursday. So, he's getting a lot of looks as well. Rams defensive coordinator Raheem Morris was actually, scheduled for a second in-person head coaching interview with the Commanders as well. But he's also being looked at, by the Seahawks, Panthers, and Falcons, who, of the latter have also done a second round of interviews with Bill Belichick. So, it's that coaching carousel. One of the things that'll be super interesting to see is, hey, look, now that we're getting to January 23rd, The NFL now allows teams to communicate and do interviews with teams that are on postseason rosters, right? I don't want to say rosters, but still coaching in the postseason. So they can still, now kind of do those interviews with coaching candidates from the 49ers, the Lions, the Ravens, and the Kansas City Chiefs. So, the Commanders are expected to travel to Detroit next week to interview Lions offensive coordinator Johnson, as well as defensive coordinator Glenn. They also have interview set up with Ravens defensive coordinator Mike McDonald and Anthony Weaver next week as well. So, I think what that's going to do is, kind of put them in position that they can evaluate head coaching candidates, but then also be right there in the timeline that, hey, look, if their respective team doesn't make it to the Super Bowl, they still have the opportunity to interview those people to do it, right? Paul wants to know why my team is not reaching out to Mike McCarthy. I would drive him personally to DC for an interview. It's interesting. I've never been one to really take a divisional team's trash as my head coach, for starters. I still think that McCarthy can be valuable in a certain way, whether that's as a head coach or whether he goes back to being a coordinator, kind of remains to be seen. But I wish you guys nothing but the best in trying to figure out that coaching circus down there. As you guys figure out what you're going to be doing with him and that coaching staff, there's a very good possibility that you're going to be needing a defensive coordinator coming up. I don't think Dan Quinn is going to get the spot in DC. However, what I could see happening is that, Dan Quinn's probably going to end up somewhere in the NFL as a head coach. And, look, let's be honest. Guys like that don't get 3, 4, 5 team interviews without getting selected somewhere in the NFL. So, you guys are going to have your own coaching carousel down there to figure out. And, who you bring in as defensive coordinator is going to be interesting. But, now that we look at who's left on the list for our coach, there's a lot of talk that the 3 basic front runners are, and let's kind of call it in the order, so to speak, is Lions offensive coordinator Ben Johnson, the Ravens defensive coordinator Mike McDonald, and Texans offensive coordinator Bobby Slowick. Now, keep in mind that Slowick has ties to the San Francisco 49ers and the Washington Commanders, having been through the Shanahan tree, so to speak. So that does kind of give him some preference, so to speak. Whether or not that gives him any leverage to become head coach, I don't know. I've never been truly a fan of 1-year coordinator wonders to become head coaches. That's not to say that they may not be really good head coaches, but you kind of want to see them be established as coordinators and be good at their craft before they jump right to head coaching. So even though Bobby Slowick's in his first year down there as offensive coordinator with the Houston Texans, did amazing things under D'Amico Ryans with rookie CJ Stroud, I'm not 100% convinced that he is the right guy for our team here in DC as the head coach. Like I said, that's not necessarily a knock on him that he wouldn't be a good head coach. The jury's still out on him, right? Ben Johnson, who's been offensive coordinator up in Detroit for the last 3-4 seasons, with Jared Goff, and you kind of see that transformation that they've taken since the Stafford trade, and how, with the help of Dan Campbell and GM, have built that offense through free agency and the draft to where he's made that offense what it is, that they're competing on Sunday against the 49ers for the chance to go to the Super Bowl. Just kind of, puts more stock in what Johnson brings to the table and what he's accomplished and what he can do, and kind of how he can correlate that into being a head coach, right? So my money right now is on Ben Johnson. If it's not Ben Johnson, I'd love to see Mike McDonald. Yes, he's the defensive coordinator, But, Ravens, great organization, great winning culture. Look, they're in the AFC Championship again, knocking on possibly, keeping the Chiefs from going to the Super Bowl and going to the Super Bowl themselves. And, oh, by the way, he's, got one of the, the best defenses in the NFL 2 years in a row now. So, he obviously he knows what he's doing, and it's doing well, right? So I would be willing to bet that maybe not next week, but within the next week and a half, or probably by the next time we're on Commander's Gridiron, we're going to be talking about who the new head coach is, what that head coach brings to the table, what we kind of think his vision is, how he's going to lead the team. Hopefully, maybe even the starts of some coordinators and assistants under him, at least being talked about, if not being already decided. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where we go from there, right? Hell, I might even have a chance in 10 years. JV, varsity, college, NFL. Shit, man, you might even skip college and go right to the NFL because of the Rooney Rule, right? I'll hire you. I mean, if let's throw it in, right? Anything can happen. So, there's always going to be some news coming up. There's probably going to be the next big announcement for our team is who the head coach is, especially now that we have our GM. So, one of the things, as we look at, hey, look, is there enough to talk about in a show here, Commander's Gridiron? You talk about the ownership, you talk about GM, you talk about the head coaching vacancies, who you want to see. Look, I'm not going to tie up, a half hour to the number 2 draft position and what we need in the off season for our holes and roster. That's a whole future episodes of Commander's Gridiron. That gives me stuff to talk about in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and into the off season, what our needs are, what we're going to target for draft. I'm not a mock draft person, but let's look at who the candidates are out there that could possibly fill our holes, blah, 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 blah. So as I look at the last 2 topics that we're going to talk about here tonight, you see them rolling across the ticker down at the bottom there. First up is the musical lineup for this year's Super Bowl, which is going to be hosted by the Las Vegas Raiders out in Las Vegas. I'll be honest, I'm jealous. I love going to Vegas. Haven't been there in a couple of years. Love to get back out there. Always stuff to do. Always a good time. But, it was announced early on that Usher is doing the halftime show of the Super Bowl this year. Kind of hit some mixed reaction. Kind of hit some of the older people, kind of like in my era, who, kind of grew up in the Usher era, that, hey, look, somebody from us, not some, newbie that's, going to be the halftime performer. It's going to be Usher. It'll be interesting to see who he brings on stage, kind of help out with that halftime performance. But then, it's interesting that probably a couple of days before this announcement came out, a lot of people were wondering, who's doing the national anthem, who's doing this, who's doing that kind of deal. So the NFL came out on Thursday with basically their pregame musician lineup. And, basically they announced that country legend and superstar Reba McEntire is going to be doing the national anthem. Post Malone is going to be doing America the Beautiful. And Andra Day is going to be doing Lift Every Voice and Sing. So I got to be honest with you, that's a pretty awesome pre-game lineup from a musical standpoint. It was super interesting that, as soon as they came out with that announcement, so many people were jumping all over social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc., that, why wasn't Post Malone doing the halftime show? Maybe this is a stepping stone to him doing next year's Super Bowl halftime show. Remains to be seen. Who knows? But, when you can get that kind of genre mix from different artists, whether it's country, whether it's pop, whether it's top 40, as well as, you throw in Andra Day, who's a superstar in her own right, to do those 3 musical numbers before the game even starts, just kind of sets, such an amazing environment, which is the Super Bowl, the most watched sporting event in the world on an annual basis. It's still on my bucket list to attend some point in time in my lifetime, whether my team is in it or not. I would love to see it, with Washington in it someday, but I would rather just be there as a fan of football just to see a Super Bowl before I die. But, as Paul says, okay, as we mostly cover the NFC East, the Twine, one of our teams makes the Super Bowl. We at Out of the Box Sports need to make the road trip. Won't be my team. I know that, right? Exactly. So I don't see DC, making a Super Bowl run anytime soon, probably in the next 3 to 5 years. But that doesn't mean I'm getting any younger. Super Bowls aren't getting any cheaper. So therefore it means road trip. Maybe when DC gets their new stadium and they finally host the Super Bowl, that might be my opportunity to get there. Even though it might not be much of a road trip. But, like I said, none of the fact, with Reba, Post Malone, Andra, and Usher, it's still going to be a star-studded, musical night along with what, looks to be just a slobber knocker of a Super Bowl game, whether it's the 49ers, the Detroit Lions, the Baltimore Ravens, or the Kansas City Chiefs. Me personally, I'd like to see the Detroit Lions and the Ravens just because I don't want to see the Kansas City Chiefs in the Super Bowl, but that's me. So who knows? We'll see what happens after the conference championship games this weekend. As Paul says, expensive last year. I was lucky to get 2 tickets. I sold each of them for $13,000. Whoa! But he bought them each for 23. Man, I would have paid you like $3,000 for each, and you still would have made a couple $100. And then we both would have went to the game. But before we wind down for tonight's episode, as you see rolling across the ticker at the bottom, the last topic that we have not talked about was RG3 and the Jay Gruden Twitter battles, right? And as Ken says, Jay Gruden versus RG3 at UFC 290. Holy shit, that'd be amazing, right? And a lot of people are like, well, first off, what is happening? Where is this coming from? What's the beef? And look, it wouldn't be Commander's Gridiron if I didn't tell you about the beef, didn't tell you how it started, where we're going. So hang on, sit down, buckle up, strap in, and we're going to get you started. So I was talking earlier before the show tonight with Paul, and I'm trying to jog my memory exactly how it started, but I want to say around week 18, Jay Gruden comes on a local DC sports show every week. I want to say every Tuesday, every Monday, maybe I think it's Tuesday afternoons, basically give a recap of the Washington Commanders and their performance for the previous Sunday, a little critique from a coaching perspective, some insight into what happened and why, certain decisions, yada, yada, yada. But then they were talking about something, and Jay Gruden made the comment that if the offensive line were to pick up the blitz and the quarterback were to be good enough to read the blitz, as in pick up the hot blitz read from a defense, it would keep the quarterback from getting injured. And it's a coaching thing, right? Basically, in how you prep your team, how you coach your team, to recognize those things, adapt to them, et cetera, et cetera. So the comment was made on the air by Jay Gruden after that discussion, that to no effect and no direct quote, but basically paraphrasing, Jay Gruden said, if the quarterback were to read the hot blitz better and the offensive line were to block the blitz better, the quarterback would not be under as much duress and nearly injured as much as he was, or as they could be in this season, right? And he doubled down on that by saying, if I ever got in a position where I coached like that, please remove my coaching immediately, or please remove me from coaching immediately. And didn't think anything of it, kind of, tongue in cheek, whatever you want to throw into it, from Jay Gruden on a radio show, whatever. But as we know, RG3, who's kind of in NFL circles now, doing, NFL pregame stuff, whether it's Thursday nights, Monday nights, whatever, ESPN analyst, blah, 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 blah. Basically, jumps on Twitter and basically replies to Jay Gruden's statement with the eye emojis and basically says, "Do you really want to go there?" to Jay Gruden. Well, now you got so for those of you that don't know, when Jay Gruden took over as coach of DC, Robert Griffin was the number one overall, or actually, the number one draft pick for the Commanders. I think number two overall that year, where we basically sent all of our draft picks just to get RG3. And in 2014 is when, actually 2013 is when RG3 got hurt. 2014 is when he got drafted, got hurt, and he actually started Kirk Cousins, who was drafted the year before. I can get my timeline right. The year before, the same year as RG3, just in a later round, fourth or fifth round, something like that. And then, of course, now the Twitter beef ensues, right? So, basically RG3 calls out Jay Gruden for being, hey, look, what are you talking about? If I were to be able to pick up blitzes more O-line, that kind of deal. So they went back and forth. They talked about, Jay Gruden went so far as to say, why Kirk Cousins started, why RG3 was benched, yada, yada, yada. RG3 didn't want to hear it, was giving him a bunch of slack. Then from Jay Gruden's official Twitter on January 18th, Jay Gruden tweeted out the following, which has since been deleted and taken down, but yours truly was smart enough to screenshot it, that you weren't good enough. Kirk was better. Cleveland didn't want you. Baltimore didn't either. Quit blaming me. Holy shit. That was like 7 o'clock at night. So, RG3 isn't going to let that go. Now, you don't know what RG3 is doing at night, where he is in the country, whatever. So, lo and behold, the next morning, RG3 replies, says something like, why, I forget what the tweet was, but, basically, I wouldn't be in the league or wasn't in the league as long by getting signed by teams if I wasn't wanted or wasn't, adequate at being quarterback or backup quarterback, whatever. Then Jay Gruden replies, "Do you really want to play that game?" And so then the beef gets better, and RG3 replies to that and says, "I'm not playing games. I'm retired. You have the free invite to come on my show and discuss it face to face." Best line, "I know where all your bodies are buried, Jay. Don't play with me." Now, subsequently, come to find out earlier tonight that Jay Gruden actually has a podcast, or went on somebody's podcast recently, as of a couple of days ago, or the end of last week, basically saying that, the beef between him and RG3 has been buried. There is no more beef. But the timeline of that podcast and his announcement and these tweets between RG3 and Jay Gruden don't necessarily line up together-ish. So, if you look at Jay Gruden's Twitter, a lot of that stuff has been deleted. RG3 kind of the same way, but, nothing ever gets in the middle of some good juicy beef here in DC between a former coach and his star quarterback at one point in time. So, look, if there ain't stuff to talk about, the current team, current players, current management, there's something to talk about with former players and former head coaches, right? So definitely something that I'm going to keep my eye on, see if the beef has died down, see if it's been quelled, or, if this thing's still going strong. I'm going to try and find a podcast, see if I can listen to it, get some insight, kind of do some backtracking, see if I can find some more information about what's going on between Jay and RG3. But, like I said, hey, it's interesting that, former players and coaches aren't afraid to get into, SPACs, on social media over their differences that they had 10 years ago. And it's interesting because, back then, or even right after it happened, never would have happened. You'd never see this happen. You'd never see these guys jumping on social media. You'd never see these guys, going back and forth with each other. maybe write a book about it. Who knows? That kind of deal. But, never social media posts, never reply to that. Blah, 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 blah. Take it on, take it on First take it on ESPN Sports Center, take it on, whatever sports debate show, whatever. It's just interesting that, that happens. Taking the points show, January 18th, Gruden settles the beef with RG3. So, hey, look, that was literally, 4 days ago, 5 days ago. So maybe the beef is buried. We're going to listen in, find out, and, we'll give you an update here at the next Commanders Gridiron show. And, with that being said, we're coming up on our hour for tonight. Next episode, we're going to dive into, what exactly we're going to possibly do with that number 2 overall pick. There's a lot of speculation that we're going to go quarterback. Do we go offensive line? It's going to be one of the two, right? It'll be interesting to see what happens. By the time we come to our next episode, we're going to have a head coach. I feel confident that we're going to have a head coach name. So we're going to talk about who that individual is, where that individual comes from, what his vision is, how he intends to lead our team, how he intends to rebuild the team, right? And as Paul says, Mayock says Jaden Daniels. I honestly think Jaden Daniels, a lot of people want Drake May. I think Drake May, without getting into the weeds, is Sam Howell 2.0. I have some personal ulterior motives for getting, Williams or Daniels into DC from a sports memorabilia collector perspective, but, we can talk about that on the next episode. But I think that, until you find your franchise quarterback, you gotta keep shooting for that, right? And when you have the number 2 overall pick, unless you come out and say Sam Howell is our franchise quarterback, which nobody's done yet, then you keep taking that top pick to try and get that franchise quarterback or find that franchise guy. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about, is there still beef between these two guys? We'll have more information on probably a slew of other things. We're getting into, here at the end of the month, we're going to have the college all-star games. We're going to be getting ready for, in February, we're going to have the NFL Combine. So we're going to talk about that and who has declared for the draft, who's getting ready for the NFL Combine, who's skipping the NFL Combine, et cetera, et cetera. So, as we kind of go into our shows, even though they're not going to be every week, we're still going to have definitely enough stuff to talk about, league-wide, and especially for the Washington Commanders here at Commanders Gridiron. So with that being said, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. Stay tuned to social media for the next date of our show. It'll definitely be on a Tuesday. It'll be on Tuesday nights at 8:30. We're just not sure what exactly date that will be yet. So with that, thank you for watching. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Steve Lockman. Have a good night.